Alireza Firouzja is at it again. Who needs a queen, eh? This time he's playing against MVL in a tournament that was played in Paris last year, and this is a blitz game. Firouzja has white here, and we get this open Sicilian on board. So Maxime goes for this Taimanov variation. We have knight f6, knight c3, knight c6 here, and now Firouzja goes with bishop to e2 developing. Sometimes you take immediately, or knight b to d5. And now we had a6 from Maxime. Often this looks very standard in the Najdorf structures, but here it's not so good because you weaken a lot of dark squares, and really you want to be playing d6 in these structures to prevent e5. And that's what we see now as a problem with this way of playing. So Firouzja chops on c6, the pawn recaptures, and now he kicks on with pawn to e5. And the problem now is that when this knight jumps into the centre, the white knight comes into e4. We don't want to chop here and give black this lovely solid centre. But by coming into e4, we make this knight a bit of a liability, kind of stuck out on a limb with c4 coming. And this is the problem, that if you develop with, say, bishop to e7 now, then c4 comes. And the knight doesn't really have a good square to go to. If you come to b4, a3 comes, so you'd have to come back to b6. And positionally, this is just very good for white after bishop to e3 or knight to d6. It's a very dodgy position for black. So that's why bishop e7 wasn't played. Instead, we saw queen to c7. And now the idea is that if you go pawn to c4, you can take here as black and you're counter-attacking the white knight. So that's why Firouzja didn't go pawn to c4. He now jumped straight in with knight to d6 check. The bishop captured, the pawn recaptured, and now you can't take with the queen here or you're running into c4, taking advantage of this pin. So instead of taking, MVL went queen to b6 here. We had pawn to c4 now. The knight jumped back to f6, which is available now because the pawns come to d6. And we had castles from white. And it's a really difficult position for black to play now. This bishop's a big problem, stuck in behind its own pawns. The only place you can bring it to is b7, but then you have to play c5 first to liberate it like this. So that's why we had c5 now. And here we had bishop to e3, eyeing this sensitive pawn. And here the problem for black is that if you castle immediately, then you're running into pawn to b4. You can't capture here as you'd wish to, so you'd have to take with the queen, and then rook to b1 comes, and after the queen moves away, say to a5, you can no longer harmoniously develop your bishop. So that's why instead of castles, Maxime tried playing the knight into e4 first, because now if you play pawn to b4, which is still a good move, at least here black can take on d6. Now you can still chop, chop, take on c5, and you're doing well here as white. But okay, Firouzja's playing for more here, so why rush the position? Instead, after knight to e4, he plays bishop to f3, hitting this lovely diagonal. Bishop to b7 defends the knight, and now we had pawn to b4. And again, you can't take with the queen, or rook b1 comes and you're losing a piece. So that's why after b4 we had queen takes on d6. And this sets up a really nice combination from Firouzja. Again, he could capture and be doing quite well because of this weak pawn. But instead, he plays bishop takes on e4. Now the queen has lost its defender, so it has to take this queen on d1. And now you could recapture with the rook and still be doing well, but instead Firouzja goes for the really fun line, bishop takes on b7. Now the queen has to run away from the attack of the rook, and now we take the rook in the corner. So in compensation for the queen, white has rook, bishop and bishop. So more than enough material here. A really excellent idea from Firouzja, cashing in on his great position. The pawn now took on b4, and here Firouzja played rook f to d1. Note that you don't want to go bishop c5 immediately and stop black castling, because then d6 is good. If you take that pawn, then the king can come to d7, hitting this one and hitting here, and suddenly white is actually worse. So that's why the bishop didn't come to c5. We had rook f to d1. Now we had castles from black hitting this bishop. The bishop retreated, rook to c8 hits this pawn, c5 defends, And now pawn to a5, bolstering this one. It's really hard to find moves now actually for Maxime because his pieces get tied down to the defence of this d7 pawn, and that pawn is critical because it's stopping the advance of this one. So pawn to h3 now from Firouzja, no need to rush things, give the king some room. Pawn to f6, rook to d2, and there's a very simple plan now to double on the d file and pressure this pawn. So rook to c7 over protects. Now we have the other rook coming to the d file. Pawn to h6, bishop to h5 now, threatening to come to e8 and add more pressure here. So that's why king to f8 to stop that move. Bishop to f4 hits this rook. It slides across to a7 here. And now bishop to b8, further harassing the rook and then sliding into d6. And these bishops are just absolute monsters. So king to g8 now, very hard for black to do much at all. Bishop to e8 here, pawn to b3, captures, bishop to e7, and there's just so much pressure against this pawn now that it's going to cave in. There's nothing black can do. a4 was tried as a last-ditch effort to run this one down the board, but now bishop takes on d7, pawn to a3, pawn to c6 hits the rook, it jumps away to the a file, bishop to c5 hits it again, the rook comes to a5, and now bishop takes on a3 was the final move of the game. If you recapture this bishop, then pawn to c7 is a killer. You can't stop it from queening. Awesome queen sack from Firouzja, and if you want to see another epic queen sack, then do click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.